Kank. Well, hello. Well, hello there.
Heavens!
You caught me in a moment of undress. Welcome back to Pencil to Pencil. It must be Wednesday. It must be must-see internet when you see these fine...
Must-see internet?
Must-see, not must-see TV. It's must-see internet when you see your fine feathered friends from Pencil to Pencil back again. I'd like to do a round of introductions. I'm your first host. My name is Jamar Nicholas. I am a cartoonist in good standing. Also, I am on the board of the National Cartoonist Society. That is a thing that may come up tonight. I am also a graphic novelist. My series, Leon the Extraordinary, that Steve Conley happens to be holding up, is the origin story of my character, which is a series at Scholastic under the Graphics imprint. My next book in the series, Leon, Worst Friends Forever, is a month away, you guys. October 1st. It's in the streets. Where you going now, Steve?
I was getting my calendar to jot down release date.
I thought you were going to leave and like run down to the Barnes and Noble. Pre-order it now, why don't you? I would be remiss if I did not introduce my co-host. He is a pioneer of webcomics. When you talk about the pillars, he doesn't like me talking about world championship belts anymore. You talk about the
skin hats.
That's right.
Pioneering of webcomics.
That's right. The Davy Crockett of webcomics. You may know him in these streets as Stone Cold Steve Conley. What's up, Steve Conley?
Good to see you guys. I was just reading Leon, just trying to brush up on when the next volume comes out.
Fantastic.
Good to see you. My name is Steve Conley. I write and draw the webcomic The Middle Age. Episode 313 was just posted. You can check them all out at middleagecomic.com. It's also on Webtoons and Tapas and Go Comics. And I make some RPG stuff, some Dungeons and the Dragons stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I would be remiss if I didn't introduce our co-host, the co-host who walks, the maestro of mark making, Mr. Mike Manley.
Hello, everyone.
Well, hello.
My name is Mike Manley, and I probably drew your childhood. Right, exactly. And I currently, in my 14th or 15th year on Judge Parker, and my 8th year on The Ghost Who Walks, the Phantom.
Yeah. But you know what, Mike, when you mention drawing people's childhoods, sometimes it just doesn't align itself with comic books. It could be any type of media or printed matter. Because I know for a while you did a lot of coloring books too, didn't you?
Right, yeah. Early in my career, I did kids' books, activity books, which included coloring books. And then I moved in the 90s into animation. So now I meet people who, love the cartoons that I worked on, doing storyboards and character designs and background design. So one of the things about comics is that it was a really good training ground to be able to do a lot of other things, because you got to keep putting dinner on the table, and things kind of go in. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And right now we're going through, I think, another time where there's a lot of people in various stages of their career who are struggling, having to look sideways and in different things to do to stay employed. I know that the Animation Union is currently trying to negotiate a new contract. I was just reading up on that today. So I've always felt that the secret really to my longevity is not being good, because good is relative, but to a certain extent, but also being flexible. In comics, you had to do a lot of different things. You have to draw the people. You have to draw Batman, but you also have to draw Gotham City, and you have to draw. When you draw Superman, you also have to draw the Daily Planet, and so it really gives you a good skill set to be able to move, if you're interested, into doing different things, which is why I was really excited to talk to our guest tonight, because I feel like, especially artists who worked in animation from his era, we're sort of the same thing. You had to work in a lot of different styles and a lot of different places, which is something that people don't really think about. Like when you see the end of a cartoon, you see the credits, and most of the people I came to know who worked in animation, who were at least my age, if not older, worked on all kinds of different stuff. So, you might be working on Scooby-Doo, but then you're working on the Funky Phantom, or you're working on Godzilla, or you're working, whatever that next season. And so I'm sure Robert will have a lot of great anecdotes about that. But I would say that's something I try to tell younger artists, is to be flexible. And if you have a good base of core skills of drawing, then that gives you that flexibility to be able, and it's also something that I was interested in. Like, I always loved cartoons as much as I loved comic books.
Mm-hmm.
I loved cartoons as a kid. I mean, my earliest memories are like watching the Flintstones, and a big deal for me was like watching Johnny Quest. In fact, I remember, I would have like a ice cream float, and it would be great if I could watch it at my grandparents' house because they had a color TV.
Oh, yeah, say no more. I love it.
Right. So for kids like me, or from the 60s, not everybody had a color TV, right? My grandparents had a color TV. Both my grandparents, and in fact, my dad's father was a TV repairman. That was his job.
Mm.
So going to your grandparents' house to watch Batman or Lost in Space or whatever your favorite, Johnny Quest, and seeing what the actual thing in color was just like, right. Yeah.
That's like 4K in the 60s. Like,
yeah,
color was 4K. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everybody is just, if you didn't turn your TV with a pair of pliers at a certain point, you didn't have the channel lock out trying to get the thing, it's like everybody is we're so wealthy with just entertainment, just like globbing over all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, most of the people that I learned from, or I got to meet when I came into the business, not only comics but in animation, they worked on a large variety of things, and not always things that they wanted to work on, but it's like, hey, I gotta pay the rent.
Yeah.
That's something that I think gets lost sometimes. I think with this more modern I would say with my generation of people coming in to comics, it was very different from, say, like Williamson or Buscema or Kirby or any of those guys, because a lot of those guys got out of the business in the 50s when comics kind of crashed. A lot of guys tried to get into strips, and if they couldn't get into strips, they went into advertising.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you lived in California, you probably went to work in animation.
I like when I was in school, we were studying commercial art, which about is this vague term.
Right, commercial. Yeah, commercial.
Just any art, we'll make art for money, whatever. Yeah.
Well, that might be a really great segue into tonight's guest. Guys, we've been hitting you over the head with A+ prime content the past couple of months. We had Steve Purcell here last week. Man, what a show! And we're just going to keep that energy going with our good friend Robert Alvarez, who's in the green room, master animator, director. And when you talk about drawing people's childhoods, you name it, Robert's probably touched it in some way. And we're just going to have a really exciting chat with him. So, Robert, you're on deck. Be prepared to beam. Let me clear the screen and let's get this conversation started. Guys, you're going to really love this. Welcome to Pencil to Pencil, Robert Alvarez. Ping! Hello.
Good to see all of you.
Hello. Robert, thanks so much for joining us tonight. I just asked the chat to name some of their favorite cartoons, and this is a nice little sidebar. Kirk's pencil just said Captain Caveman and the Pink Panther. And I posit if we just kept throwing things on the screen, you might go, yeah, I worked on that. Yeah, I worked on that. Yeah, I worked on that. So when people talk to you these days, how does it usually start? Is it like, what haven't you worked on? Is that a fair question to ask you at this point?
Well, if I meet somebody out of animation, it's not like it comes up in conversation, so they don't even know unless I tell them. And but people that I've worked with over the years, the conversations are different with them because they sort of know what you've done, and they very seldom go like, well, what was it like? So I very rarely ever have that conversation with people and having them asking me like about a certain show or what was it like. It's pretty rare. It's like people like yourself might ask me like, well, what was it like working with Ed Love or Bill Hanna or Ray Patterson? Because you know, and or certain shows, but almost never get asked those questions outside of people that are in the know.
You don't get asked by younger people you might meet in animation, or
you know what's interesting, and I had this conversation with Gendy, and you all know who Gendy is, right?
Right.
I had this conversation several years back while we were still working in the studio before we got kicked out for COVID. I had this conversation with him, and young people just don't know in animation the history of that. The most of them don't know the history of animation. They don't know what came before, and they don't care. They don't even care about what they're doing in the present and what they're working on. And they don't really go back and go like, hey, well, what was it like when you started working in the industry? Or what was, what was it like working with some of those old veterans who did? They don't know them, and they don't know the shows that they may have done. So there's a general lack of knowledge of young people in the industry. They really, I always tell the story, like most young people are strictly interested in, the photographs of what on their cell phone or what they had for dinner last night. They just don't seem to have an interest in learning about the history of animation. Now, I'm not saying that's true 100% of everyone, but I had conversations all the time when I was in the studio, and a lot of times I would ask this question before I even finished the question. I already knew what the answer was. I would say, have you ever heard of, and I already know they were going to say no. If you ask them about an old movie or an old show or something, they just don't know because they don't seem to have an interest in learning the history of their craft, which is kind of amazing when you think about it.
I wonder if, because I've talked about this before, and I wonder if because of what has happened with basic cable, right? And I think this is sort of generational. So I have friends who are in their mid-20s who don't know the Flintstones, right? And you think like, how could you not know the Flintstones, right? I mean, that's like, I don't know, that's like milk in the grocery store or something, right? But I think what I realize is that, and this also comes from teaching, is once you get out of the 80s and into the 90s, cable changed. And so when I came home from school as a kid, every day you had Hanna-Barbera stuff. You had all these reruns of these old cartoons that you saw over and over again, because that's what was all that was on. So if you're going to watch TV, that's what you saw. But as basic cable came on, then they took this package of these cartoons. Well, they're not there anymore, and they're over on Nick at Night or whatever. So I wonder if that also contributes to the fact that you just, you watched Fox Kids when you came home, and that was your.
When I was a kid, and we're talking ancient history now because I'm a fossil. In the 50s, I watched television all the time, and I liked cartoons and I liked old movies, and the cartoons that they were running back then were the old cartoons that were available at that time, which were like the Fleischer cartoons, Terry Toons, and occasionally you might see on Disney show on Sunday, they might have run some cartoons. So I watched everything, and it's different. But once I would work, before I even started working, I was watching Saturday morning stuff because I wanted to see what was going on. And when I first started working, I would watch some of the stuff on Saturday morning to see like if it was a show that I worked on or a scene I might have worked on. But then I stopped watching after a certain period of time because I was doing it every day, and the last thing I wanted to do was go home and watch cartoons. So I don't know about the cable thing. I do know that once like Cartoon Network launched their channel, they got a lot of people watching it, but that was stuff that they were doing started in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And they were very popular and all that, but I didn't watch the stuff all the time because I would see it at work, and I didn't really have it. I didn't want to go home and watch the stuff that I was working on. I just didn't. It's like, like an actor who you interview a famous actor and they'll say, no, I never look at my work, because a lot of times when you look at stuff that you worked on, and I can think of a lot of shows that this happened to me on, you see something that finally hits the air and you go, oh God, that's terrible. And, but it's on. And so I very seldom would watch stuff. Now that I'm retired, occasionally, like at night, I might turn on Boomerang, or I watch MeTV in the morning to watch some old cartoons, because I get to see stuff I haven't seen in a long time. And sometimes Boomerang might run some old HB show that I worked on, and then out of curiosity, I'll go, I want to see if I remember this show, and maybe I might remember a scene that I animated, and that sort of interests me now. But it's a completely different world now, I think, especially now with the digital world. I don't think kids are that interested in cartoons like I was, or a couple of generations ago.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot going on because of the cell phone and because everybody goes on YouTube, and so there's no waiting. Like, I remember when I had bought a VCR when I was 14, 15, I got a job at an appliance store specifically to get the discount to buy a VCR so I could record cartoons and I could watch them frame by frame, right?
Yeah.
And so my little brother, who is 12 years younger than me, benefited from that because you could record stuff and then watch it whenever you want, right? And that whole mentality of having to wait a week to see your cartoon if you missed it, or you didn't do your homework and your mom said you can't watch your show, that's all. There's no waiting anymore. So I do think that changes the psychology of anything being special in the way it was 40, 50 years ago. Is anything special now?
I wouldn't know. You're asking the wrong guy. I'm out of it. Like, I can't even tell you what exactly is going on in the industry, because I tell this to people all the time. When you finish a show, you're kind of forgotten. But when you retire, you don't exist. So you don't get people calling you up going, hey, this is what's going on. And you have to actually reach out to people, they're still working, going, so what's going on in the biz? And it doesn't interest me as much because it doesn't affect me like when I was working. And so I don't actively seek out each day, like, well, what's Cartoon Network doing now? What's Warner Brothers doing? Or Nickelodeon because
Right.
it doesn't affect me, and I don't really, to be honest with you, I don't care. So
Right.
I don't really know what the heck's going on. But there are people that do care and do. If you find the right people, it can tell you exactly. I have one friend who works for Apple, but he's like a supervising producer for their animated shows. He's the guy, if you want to call him up and go like, Randy, what's going on? And he'll tell you everything that's going on at every studio. And I don't know how he knows all this stuff. And he's always been that way. He's just really got all the connections. But that's
Mhm.
far and few between.
It's funny because I think that's something that I experience now, and also something that I would say is a difference between comics and animation. I think you're right. One of the things I realize is like whenever they release a box set of something that I worked on, they don't send me a copy, right? They don't, it's like it's what I call the dead check. And one of the main things I learned from my experience working in animation was when I draw a comic book, my name is on it. When I work in animation, I get about that long for my name to be on the screen, right?
Yep.
So it's a really different experience as an artist to work on a show, even a great show like Samurai Jack, than to draw a Samurai Jack comic book, because when people are reading the comic book, they're actually seeing it's all me if I pencil it or ink it. So
Right.
It's a really different mental space to be in. So I can kind of see what you're talking about. And I see it now because I haven't. The last show I worked on was Ren and Stimpy 2 years ago before it blew up again. And if it comes out, I don't, they won't call me on the phone and go, "Hey, Mike, that show you worked on is coming out." But I mean, obviously, though, despite all that stuff, I mean, following your Facebook feed, you're a guy who's really passionate about the craft and the art of animation.
Yeah, I like I said, I was watching cartoons as a kid in the 50s, but then when I got in the 7th grade and I met my friend Tim Walker, that's when I started thinking about, I think I'd like to get into the business. And in the 7th grade, I decided I want to be an animator. I didn't know how that was going to happen, and eventually it did. I still like cartoons, and I still will watch occasionally, not constantly, animation, and I appreciate the art. And I really appreciate what it takes to make cartoons, having been through all of that for many years. So I like looking at the art, and I especially like the older art. I'm not all that interested in the new stuff because in the digital world, the art really doesn't exist. You can't hold it in your hand. I like the old stuff that you can actually pick up, look at, and hold on to it, and then you can put it away. And at any time, you can open that folder or take it out of the closet, wherever you keep it, and go, "Wow, this is still great." So I like the old art, and that's what my collection is. All animation art from going back to. Well, I have stuff going back to probably like 29 or 1930.
Wow. I mean, I imagine that stuff must be pretty brittle, right? Because a lot of the old stuff.
No, not really. It depends. Like if you don't store stuff where the sunlight or heat hits it, you'd be surprised how well it holds up. Yeah, paper doesn't last forever, but I've got some Disney stuff that's really old and it still looks good. And then I have stuff. I'm trying to think now. I have stuff from the 50s. Like cells. It depends upon what studio did the cell and what was their paint that they were using. And sometimes they use cheaper cells. It just depends. So I have some Warner Brothers cells that they sent to me when I wrote them a letter in 1961. And when I got them, the paint was already chipping. So what I've done now that I have them all these years later, I just flip them over onto the reverse side and coat them with clear nail polish so that it won't chip off anymore, and preserve them that way. But it just depends. And some stuff is in better shape than others. And it also depends upon when you receive it and how you got it. Because I have some drawings that were literally, you could tell whoever drew it went, oh, this sucks, and crumbled it up and threw it in the trash. I come along, pick it out, and you can see all the wrinkles still. I have like an Alvin drawing that I pulled out of the Format Films trash can, and you still see the wrinkles, but it's a drawing of Alvin. I go, it's still great. So it just depends.
Yeah.
I have I rated your Facebook, Robert, and I stole some images that I'm going to put on the screen. So just keep talking. We'll just have a slideshow going while we're doing it.
What was it about animation in 7th grade when you're like versus other kinds of cartooning, other kinds of drawing, other kinds of art?
It's like the Mr. Toad in the film The Wind in the Willows. Mm-hmm. When he sees the car and his eyes start spinning. Well, for me, it was like animation and seeing the artwork. That's from Calvin and the Colonel, one of my favorite shows. I just fell in love with the art, and I went, I had to get as much as I possibly could, and I wanted to be in it. I wanted to do it. An interesting thing about this, the character on the right is Calvin, and the show was created by Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll, who did Amos and Andy on radio. And then they did this in the 60s. It was basically Amos and Andy, but it was all animal characters. And I think the show was really well written and funny. And here's the interesting fact. I eventually met in the 70s Charles Correll's son, Rich Correll, who's a big-time director and producer on live-action TV shows. And I just find it interesting that, I meet his son. But by the time I met Rich, his father had already passed away. But this is one of my favorite shows. I really, really like this show. And I have a good number of sales from Calvin and the Colonel.
Now, I wonder, because of where you grew up, because you grew up in Los Angeles.
Yes.
So maybe it seemed, because you knew the studios were there. So do you think that also meant like, oh, I want to be an animator, and it's like if I grew up in Detroit. If I said I want to make cars, well, there's all the factories, that make cars.
Yeah, the fact that the studios were right. I lived in North Hollywood in the Valley, and there were several studios there in the Valley: Hanna-Barbera, UPA, Format Films, and a lot of independent studios. So it was easy to get access to the studios and go by the studios and dig through their trash cans. And that just fueled. I'm laughing because that's from a cartoon I made in '95 at Hanna-Barbera for What a Cartoon. If I had grown up in anywhere else where there were, who knows? I have no idea what I would have been doing. But I like this. What you're showing now is a part of a storyboard that I did for a cartoon called Pizza Boy, and the title is No Tip. And it's on YouTube for anybody out there who wants to see it who's never seen it. And it's one of my favorite things that I've done during my career, because it was something I created, I wrote it, I storyboarded, I did more than half the layouts, I art directed it, and I did just almost everything on the thing. And it was fun because it was one of those things where it was mine, and no one was standing over me saying, you can't do that. Because once they greenlit it, it was really great. I got to do 2 shorts that way. And that was a lot of fun, creating your own cartoons.
Was that a cartoon?
Yeah, these were launched on, What a Cartoon. They did 48 shorts. And Fred Seibert was the one who did that. And everybody then soon followed and did similar things. And when he went to Nickelodeon, he did the exact same thing, except he was calling them Oh Yeah cartoons.
Right.
But these are all original cartoons, and they were potential pilots. And that's where Powerpuff, Dexter's Lab, Johnny Bravo, and Cow and Chicken came out of, the original 48 shorts.
I love the style of Pizza Boy. I like that. It was. I got to watch that earlier today. Where did your style come from? Or did you come up with that style specifically for this story?
Well, I had been working with Pat Ventura, who did 6 shorts on What a Cartoon, and I saw that you could do almost anything and get away with it. And so the characters were like my design and everything, but animation, doing directing on his, I figured out, well, okay, you can do this, or you can, there's a lot of things you can do and it will work. So I was influenced by Pat, but the stuff was just, it just came out of my head, you know, the character designs, the story, everything about it. And it was a lot of fun doing that, a lot of fun.
Yeah, the characters have so much life. They're so bendy. They're so, every part of them is like, I don't know, plastic man. You know.
If you go back and watch it, you'll notice that the characters don't stay consistent in design. In other words, sometimes depending on who drew the layouts, they might change something. But that doesn't bother me, because I firmly believe that, you know, you don't have to do all this nonsense about everything has to hook up and everything has to be like it was stamped out, you know, and looks exactly identical, which the way cartoons are done now. So I didn't care. It was all about making the cartoon, making it funny, and telling the story. So sometimes if I drew the character, he looks one way. If my friend Mark Kauser drew the character, he looked a different way. And I think Andy Bioch worked on it too, and he had his own. And Craig Kellman, who's a great designer, and he drew it completely different. So, but it all works, I think.
That's great. They're absolutely identifiable from panel to panel, even if they're, and they seem to react to they definitely fit the environment and the moment that they're in. I think it's great. Really fun.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I noticed as a kid, going back to my story about the VCR. So when I would study this stuff, the average person can't tell the difference between the animators.
Yeah.
But once you get into it, you can actually tell, this is a drawing by this person of Bugs Bunny, and this is a drawing by this person of Bugs Bunny, even though it's supposed to look like Chuck Jones.
Yeah. That previous image was also from Pizza Boy, and that particular scene was a scene that I laid out. And before, several images back, when you showed the thing from the Smurfs, it was a scene that I animated on the Smurfs. And that one, I animated that scene. And they built, I can't remember what the story was. They built some kind of contraption, and at some point that thing turns like into a bucking bronco type thing, and they're riding on it, and the thing's jumping up and down. And every once in a while, I post images of something that I actually drew or animated myself. But the majority of it is other people's drawings or art, because I haven't done everything. I've just done a good number of things.
Very cool.
So what was the first thing that you actually animated? Because I know,
Well, I did before I got into the business, I was doing some animation with an 8mm camera, and I would do, hand drawing. It was all terrible stuff. I did stuff that way. And then when I got into arts, I went to the old Chenard Art School. I did a couple of short films there that I animated. And the first job that I can recall actually getting paid, I was an assistant, but I actually got paid to animate, was George Slatter did a pilot, and it was going to be like an international version of Laugh-In, except it was called Wacky World. Mm-hmm. And because it was not a lot of money in it, the guy that was handed out this animation was giving out to people that he knew scenes to animate, and they were maybe like 10 or 15 seconds long. And it was a little world character, and mine had a beret on his head, and everything was like straight ahead. So you had to then go back and color everything with markers, because they didn't have the budget for cells. So that was probably the first thing I got paid to animate. And that was sometime in 1970, I think. And I still have the rough drawings from that scene.
They didn't. I guess, did you animate it? Like, I know at Disney, they would animate and they do a test and you would look at it. Were you guys able to do that at all, or you just had to flip it?
Well, you would flip your drawings and hope for the best. And then I think Mike Sanger, who was kind of in charge of the different little bits of animation, he went over it, because he was a more experienced and more talented animator than I was at the time. And he probably changed, if I remember correctly, some of the stuff. but I don't think they were even pencil testing it. I think they just shot it. But the show never sold, so it doesn't really matter. I like that drawing from that. That's a Craig Kelman drawing from Pizza Boy.
That's so punchy. I love that.
And this was also back when, well, were these Xeroxed or were these inked?
Those are Xerox, but the way they did it was the lines on the layouts were thick lines, so that and the models were drawn that way. So they knew that they had to have a thick outline, so it would be that sign. And the actual ink and paint and the assistant work was done at a studio in Manila. So we did the layouts for the shorts, well, at least my 2 shorts, in-house at Hanna-Barbera because we had a budget. And then the work, it was so well laid out that it was really pretty simple for them to do the finishing touches and the assistant work.
Why don't you explain to the uninitiated viewer actually what a layout is?
Well, first you have a storyboard, and you saw several panels back, storyboard for 2 pages from Pizza Boy. The layout artist would gets the storyboard, and he realizes how many drawings he's got to do for the scene because of the way the panels are. And some scenes are going to be really simple, and some are going to be more complex. Like that in that scene, while I was slugging the board, which is directing, and that's an old-fashioned term, and it's an old-fashioned way. This is when directing really was directing, as opposed to what it is now, because now it's the title director is a lot of bullshit, because director, there are some people that can't direct traffic, much less a show, and they get the title of director. And so I would put in extra poses that you see at the top, and they would be incorporated into the layouts. And then that's how you did your timing. So you would take these panels, and you would obviously have to do a layout drawing for your background, which would just show the background, and there'd be separate elements. The door is an animating element, so that would be on a separate element page. And then you do the drawings of the characters. And you can change stuff when you get into layout. If it's your own show, especially, you can, modify it, improve it. And but you have layouts, and then the layouts are given to it in the old days, are given to an animator. And the scene has been pre-directed by a director with exposure sheets. And on the exposure sheets on the left-hand side will have the direction written down, how many frames exactly it takes to go from pose 1 to pose 2, or whatever it's going to be. If it's an anticipation or an overshoot, whatever, all that's written down. And then the animator would animate using the layouts according to the director's notes on the exposure sheet. And what we did on these was did all the layouts, and then I went back, even on the scenes I didn't lay out myself, I directed every one of the scenes. So I would go back and go into the exposure sheets and expose the drawings with the timing that I wanted. But basically it's mostly there, because you can see on the bottom, that's all the slugging that I did for the storyboard prior to it even being laid out.
Right. So the slugging and the timing tells the animator how many drawings, because drawings equals.
Well, it tells them, like, for example, if you see under that middle panel, and there's like a thing where he's in a scramble, and it's like a 3 drawing scramble on ones, and you can see how many frames it is. You just add them up: 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. And then he's panning back while he's doing that. And then he's in that hold for 9 frames, still scrambling. And then he zips out in 2 frames. That tells them basically what the animator would only have to do is that cycle of him scrambling, because you're going to put it on a pan cell anyways, pan cells. So at some point he's scrambling, and he's going to pan backwards, still scrambling, and then he's going to zip out. Now the zip out might be not part of the scrambling; it might be like 2 special drawings. And but that tells the animator what he has to do. So he's doing a 3 drawing scramble on ones. I hope that makes sense.
Right. Sometimes animation's shot on 2, sometimes it's shot on 1s. One means for every frame.
Exactly.
There's another drawing. Yeah.
Well, when we were doing these shorts, because I was directing my own shorts and all that, I was doing different timing than I did later on, because like later on in the shows that I was working on, like pick any show, pretty much everything, you just know everything was going to be on 2s, unless you indicated on the exposure sheets to be on 1s for a reason. So sometimes you do that. Like if a character's running, you could say it's a six drawing cycle on 1s, and you just explain what you want on 1s. But most of the time, it's on 2s.
Right, and then that goes now or then overseas to another studio.
Yeah.
So somebody is looking at this, and the animator goes, "This is my scene.
Right.
I have to do these many drawings." So one of the things that changed while I was there, while I was working, was that way, that when I started, that's what they did after they took my board.
Yeah.
But then they started doing everything where they would make an animatic.
Right. That changed everything. With animatics, you no longer see a slug board. And what happens now in shows with animatics, you have a showrunner, and most of the showrunners now are young, and they've not really animated themselves, so they don't really know a lot. And an animatic editor assembles the show according to the track, and then he sits down with the showrunner, and the showrunner says, "Okay, give me X amount of frames between this action and that," and they're technically slugging the board, but they're not doing it the old-fashioned way. They're not breaking down all the action. So what happens is, when I would get the show after that, I'd get an animatic, a storyboard, or in the digital world, you get a copy of it in a digital format. And if you were still doing the sheets on paper, I had to make that scene work based on the timing that they made up. Now, the problem with that is most of those people don't know a damn thing about timing because they've never animated. And I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with this young director on one of the shows I was working on about a year or so or more ago. And I asked the person, I said, it was just me and that person on a Zoom meeting. I said, "Have you ever animated anything?" And the person said, "I did some in school." And I didn't want to insult the person, but I'm thinking that doesn't count. When you're doing animation in school, it's not production work. So this person had relatively no animation skills whatsoever, but they got the title of director because what happens a lot in animation today is you get elevated because you'll be a storyboard supervisor, and then they go, "Okay, now you're the director." And they're really not directing anything. They're just supervising the board, and they think they're directing the show. But they don't know a damn thing about directing. And that's what happens a lot in I would say most of the shows that are done now that are still 2D shows. CG is completely different because in CG, studios get several passes on the work as it comes back in different stages, and they can send off notes saying, do this, do that, fix this, that. But in 2D shows, that's what's happening now. You have like a showrunner and or a director for the episode you're on, and that person may have done part of the board, but not necessarily the entire board. And they get the title of director, and they really don't know how to direct.
I remember when I started I started on Superman. That's when I started on. And Dan Reba was my director, and he helped me a lot because I had to learn how to put down the screen direction, right? And that's a very specific notes so that everybody else can know, what to do. I always tell the students that it's like a blueprint. Like this window has to be over here, and it has to be high, and everybody's referring to this. And I remember there was only so many retakes you could do on those shows because of the budget and the time, so that they would send the show overseas, they would get the scene back, and they'd go like, oh, that looks really good, or like, whoa, what the hell's going on there?
Yeah.
And they would ask them to like redo that. So I was like learning all this stuff like on the job, and it was really interesting and scary for me at the same time to go through my first board and watch the show and go like, oh, okay, I'm seeing like what's going on between my board, and like, whoa, that drawing like was much better on my board, and like, and then I could really see like, oh, this is animator A, animator B got, you know, he didn't get that, he doesn't get the. So I learned so much just by taking my first board and watching the show as it, you know, and I recorded it so I could run it back. That was very. So how did you learn that? Did you learn from like the old timers who would say, yeah, hey kid, don't do that, or do this?
Yeah, well, you know, in animation, a lot of it's observation, and if you're paying attention, you learn. If you don't care to learn and to improve your status, then you don't. But I wanted to animate, so I was paying attention to what was in front of me. So when I was doing assistant work, I realized what they were doing. And then eventually when I was at Hanna-Barbera, I started working for Ray Patterson, who was an old Disney animator and had worked on a lot of the Tom and Jerry's at MGM. And he trained me as a director. And he was great. And so, yeah, I learned by picking up some stuff of observation of animators that I worked on as an assistant. And then you learn from listening to the old time professionals like Ray Patterson. And then also you can learn from observation. Like I would maybe see somebody do something in one of their cartoons. I go, hey, that's good. I'm gonna use that. And then you just copy what they did, and as far as timing goes on something. So you know it's observation to a large degree, and it's a progression. You just don't walk into the studio nowadays, or even when I was working, you don't walk into the studio and go like, oh, okay, I'm a director, let me start directing. It just doesn't work that way. The only one I know that ever did that was Tex Avery when he went to Warner Brothers. But it's a learning process, and you know you pay your dues like I did, doing assistant work, and work your way up, and then you get that break, which I got. And they finally told me, okay, you're gonna have to start animating, and I, great, terrific. And then you learn and you animate, and then the next step was direction, which I just kind of stumbled into it, and I'm glad I did, because eventually animation in LA went away because they just weren't doing it because of the cost. It was just cheaper to send it out. So I was then strictly writing sheets and slugging boards, and then in the later part of my career, it was just I would get the title of, like, on some shows as supervising animation director, but I was only writing sheets, but I was also then responsible for doing retakes and pickup lines and all that. And it's all from experience. And if you pay attention and ask questions, that's how you learn. And that's what it was for me, paying attention and asking questions and observing what other people were doing. And I just, and you know what, a lot of it too, I tell people, is like, in animation, to be successful, you have to have discipline, some skills, obviously, and a lot of luck, because things can happen to you that are just not, you can't control. And that's where you get into like problems with people who get misguided anger because they see you're getting work for something that they want to do, and so they get pissed off at you, and then they take it out on you, but it's not your problem. So it's luck. A lot of it was luck. I was in the right place at the right time on a lot of things. In 1968, when I started at a small little studio called Fred Calvert, they were doing subcontract work for Hanna-Barbera on the Banana Split show. And because I was there, in the room next to where I was working were two animators, Ron Campbell and Dwayne Crowler. They both are passed on by now. but they got contract work on Yellow Sub. And so, because I was in the right place at the right time, and they were guys that like to goof off a lot, so they got behind. So, one day Fred says to me, okay, you have to work on Yellow Sub now. Great, I'm a big Beatle fan, I want to. So I got to work on Yellow Sub because those guys were goofballs. And, it was luck. I was in the right place at the right time. And that happened to me a lot of times in my career, where just being in the right place at the right time and getting along with other people.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's also one of the things that I learned that was different from comics to animation. Is animation, everybody goes into the factory. Everybody goes into the studio, and you have the mix of personalities and people working. But as a cartoonist, I'm here all day, I maybe would go up a couple times a year to the office, but it's like a solo gig, you're not going like, oh, here comes that son of a bitch, you don't have to worry about that. It was very different because I did everything I did right here, right at this very desk. So I never moved to LA. I almost moved to LA, but so I did everything long distance. So it had benefits in that I could do other things and I could keep my own schedule as long as I turned in the work. But sometimes I think, well, I wonder what would have happened if I had moved to LA in like 1997 when I was really looking at it. But so I think that's a big difference that most people probably don't think about.
Yeah, and every studio was not the same. Some studios were a lot more easy to work with or work at. Like Hanna-Barbera was pretty laid back. As long as you did your work and did it on time, they didn't care what time you got into the studio, as long as you just did your work. Filmation was the complete opposite. It was like high school with ashtrays. They had only 2 doors into the studio, and they had a card key system. This was in their last building, and that was the way they kept track of everybody, by using your card key. And if you were 5 minutes late, you got docked and you couldn't make up the time. They were just
what? Wow.
Yeah, they were just insane. And I worked for them, I think, for about 2 seasons while I was doing other work, and I did it because it was a job and I wanted the money. But the last time I had a meeting with the then production manager of the studio, and he goes, "Oh, you're going to have to start working in." And I said, "See ya, I'm not going to do it." And I'm glad I didn't, because I wasn't there for when they, the French closed down the company after they bought it. And I continued working for Hanna-Barbera. But Hanna-Barbera was easy to go. And Cartoon Network was pretty much the same too, where they weren't like sticklers where you have to be here at a certain time and you have to work to a certain time. And it was easy. But some studios were strict and others were not. It just depended on what you were doing.
That's really interesting, and knowing how LA traffic can be crazy. I mean, you got a 2 hour. I know some people that commuted 90 minutes. The distance wasn't that far, but you'd be commuting.
Yeah, well, I live in the valley next to the San Fernando Valley. I live right below Cal Arts, which is in Santa Clarita. So I'm about 26 to 30 miles away from the studios. But then I changed my habits of working, especially when my parents got older and I was taking care of them. I would check in on them after work each day. So I would go into work early so I could leave early. And after they were gone, when I was working at Cartoon Network, I got in between 6 and 6:15 in the morning, and I went home at 3.
Wow.
And I got all my work done. And then I usually would go home and I would have freelance on some show, and I would do the freelance for a couple hours or whatever at night. And I would do my freelance for the same, shows on the weekend. But it's a discipline. It's like in the second year I was working, Fred Calvert, who was not entirely honest because he really wasn't paying me what he was supposed to pay me, and I didn't know about the union or that stuff, he kind of realized I could do the stuff fast. So he put me in charge, supposedly, to monitor the other new guys that were doing assistant work for him on these shows. And one of the guys was a guy that graduated from Chenard that I knew. And he came up to my desk one day and he said to me, he goes, "Well, you've been doing this for a while, and you must know the tricks on how to do it fast. And I said, no, there are no tricks. You sit your ass down at the desk and just do the work. That was a drawing that I pulled from the trash at Format Films, and you can see some animators obviously didn't like it and crumbled it up and threw it away, but I think it's great. But yeah, it's just discipline. Showing up is half the battle, and you'd be surprised now with a lot of the young people. They show up like at 10 o'clock, and then they go to lunch at 12, and then they come back maybe at 1:30 or 2, and then they take a long break. And and then they complain like, oh, we don't have enough time to meet our deadlines. It's like, well, if you sit your ass down and do your work and don't screw around all day, you can get the stuff done. It's not impossible. I did it for 55 years.
What's that from, this background?
That's the Smurfs.
That's the Smurfs.
Smurfs, okay. Yeah. And it's very different now, like from when I started in the mid 96. But I do remember when I was in high school, I really wanted to work in animation, comics and animation. I figured you could do both. Why not?
Right.
And Hanna-Barbera at that time had a trainee program.
Yes.
I bought this magazine, and in the back it listed the phone number for Hanna-Barbera.
Right.
So I call the number, and some grizzly old bastard answers the phone and goes, I tell him, I'm interested in blah, blah. He goes, you don't want to work in animation, kid. It's a shit business.
I bet I know who the guy was. Was it Harry Love?
I don't know, but whoever it was, he would sound like he sounded like the Thing, from the Fantastic Four.
Not everybody that is in those from the vintage days were nice people. Some of them were assholes, and you just, if they were above you and like had more important jobs, you just had to grin and bear it. I worked for one guy he was in charge of the animation. You'd go in on Mondays and you'd get your section of work that you had to do for the week, and you'd have to turn it back in next Monday. And this guy was a prick. He didn't like the younger animators, but he was really nice to the older ones. So one day he's handing out animation to me on a Smurfs show, and the Smurfs had built this robot out of a tree, and it's wood, and they're going to get inside and work in it, so it's a mechanical thing. And he says to me, so this tree has to be stiff animation, and you excel at that. I wanted to tell him, you know what, go fuck yourself, you asshole. But I couldn't, because I know I would get fired, and I needed the job. But he was a prick. And the last day he was there, when he was having a retirement party, his replacement called me up and said, hey, you want to pick up some freelance? And I got in my car and drove over there. And I'm walking the parking lot, and he sees me, and he goes, what are you doing here? With a grin on my face, I go, I'm picking up freelance. And he just was a jerk. And I worked with a number of people like that, to where you realize, okay, some of them, for whatever reason, they have an axe to grind, and they're just not nice people, and that's just the way they are. But you grin and bear it, and you smile and say thank you and all that stuff, and you get the work, and then you just the plan is to outlive them so you can piss on their graves.
Well, I often think back to that and think like, well, if that guy had not been that way,
right?
And I was in Michigan, right? So even the idea of going to California would have been difficult, because it's not like I had an aunt living in in Los Angeles or something. So it would have been a real effort to go out there and get a trainee, which I'm assuming they didn't pay you, that you just showed up, and if you were good enough, they had you working on one of their shows. So I often wonder, like, well, if I had lived in LA,
you would have got in.
Yeah,
I've seen your stuff on the Phantom, and you definitely would have got in. The problem is you just happened to talk to the wrong guy. If you had a portfolio and showed up and showed it to somebody like in layout department or something like that, or even boards, they would have immediately gone to whoever they had to and say, hey, we got to hire this guy. He's good. And you would have got in. It's just that you talked to the wrong person, and that's probably soured you for a while, but it happens. I mean, you're not the only one that got screwed over like that. Same thing happened to my wife when she went for a job at Hanna-Barbera, and it was Harry Love, and he wouldn't hire her, and he was really rude. And the guy that she went with to get a job was Ron Maidenberg, and he was a super talent, and he wanted my wife to get the job there because this is before I even knew her, because he was going to need her to get a ride to the studio each day, and Harry Love wouldn't hire her. So the guy that was with Ron, Don Jurwich, who was a producer at the time, said, go across the street to Animation Camera, they'll hire you. And she did. And that's how she got into animation. And then she worked at several studios along the way until she stopped working. But it's just like you just had the bad luck of talking to the wrong person, and you're not the only one, because I've talked to other people that have told stories about like Harry Love and other people, and I don't know why they were that way, because Harry at that point had a cush job. He didn't really have to do much. He had been an effects animator back in the heyday, and at that point he was like Joe Barbera's pal, so that's how he was working there. And it would have been in his favor to be nice to people, but he wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've experienced only a few times in comics. I was an old editor at DC when I first started working at DC who was that way. And I remember working on a job with my girlfriend at the time, who was going to do a war comic. And this guy was apoplectic in Dick Giordano's office. Like, we can't have a woman doing a war comic. You know, he was just like, you know, he smelled like an old folded shirt. You know, he was just like some bitter guy from like Central Casting. And, but, you know, what? 15, 20 years later, I ended up working in animation and working on a really cool show with so it's like, you know, I think also in the time in the 90s, that was different too, because they were really trying to hire as many good drafts people, because animation, once Lion King made all that money, everybody was funding a lot of money.
Yeah, I think that's still true today. They, you know, shows will want, of course, you know, like showrunners will do this on a lot of shows. So they want to hire their friends first and people they worked with in the past, because they know what they're capable of, and they, you know, they want to surround themselves with friendly faces. But if you have the talent, although I think it's harder to get into animation now than ever, because there's a lack of production going on. But if you have the talent, you're going to get in, and you got to keep trying. And before I got my first job, the summer before that, I went around to some of the studios, knocking on doors, and they all said no. And I thought, oh God, what am I going to do when I graduate? You know, I'm in big trouble. And I looked out because I had a friend that was working at Fred Calvert's, the studio I started at, and called me up one summer night and said, hey, you still want to get into animation? I said, yeah. He said, come on over. And the studio was like 10 minutes from my house. I drove over there, met Fred. He sat me down at a desk, had me do an in-between, and he checked on me like 20 minutes later. He said, okay, you can start tomorrow. And that's how I got in. Of course, the pay was really shitty. my first pay, get this. He said, oh, I'll start paying you as soon as we use your drawings in production, which I didn't get paid for over a month. And he was using my stuff from the start. And then finally, I think he got embarrassed to pay me. And my salary was $50 a week. Wow. And this was in '68. But you know what? I didn't care. I was in. I finally made it. I got in. So, and all things considered, but with my career and starting at $50 a week, I think I did pretty good.
Yeah. So what was your, I mean, it's a very fanish question, but of all the things that you've worked on, there have to be some things that were just like the thing that you really love doing. That's
a question I get asked all the time, and it's an easy answer. I'll add something to it, but I always say Samurai Jack was my favorite show, because I think it's the best show that I ever worked on. I worked on a lot of other shows that I liked, but Samurai Jack, the director Billy Wilder said, "You're as good as your best work." And Samurai Jack got me my first Emmy. So I did well, and I really liked the show, and I always liked working on anything with Gendy because he was a lot of fun to work with, and he's really a good guy. And he's the one guy in the business that will criticize you to your face, not behind your back, or say something that you never know about. He'll tell you, like, if you didn't, and he several times was telling me, like, hey, one time he told me this. He goes, "Hey, you fucked up, old man," because at the time I was probably 40-ish and he was still in his late 20s. And he would criticize you to your face, and I always and I consider him a friend, and I liked every show that I worked on, but Samurai Jack is my favorite, and of course I liked the 2 shorts I got to do because they were my own creations. But there are a good number of other shows that I worked on that I liked, like Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Lab, Cow and Chicken. Cow and Chicken I thought was a great show and fun to work on. I liked working on Regular Show, and a show that was called Over the Garden Wall, which was a miniseries.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a great looking show.
Yeah, yeah.
There's an early drawing there. That's from like, what, 41 or 39, wow, whenever Fantasia was done. But Samurai Jack is the one I always say is my favorite because I think it was a great looking show, and I did a couple episodes that I think really turned out well, and I just like the show. I like the look of the show.
Yeah,
I can imagine that kind of bracing criticism from Gendy would have been challenging for some people. Were you always good at taking criticism?
Well, here's the thing. In my younger days, I took criticism anytime it was handed to me. I'm including even ethnic slurs because I'm Hispanic. Let's not forget that. And you take it because you need the job, you want the money. But as I got older, it's like, don't fuck with me because I don't care what you think or what you're going to say. Because if you're going to be rude to me, I'm going to hit you right back with it. And especially towards the end of my career, although I don't have any examples at the end of my career where anyone was really mean or rude to me, but I just got to the point where I go, I don't need to take that shit anymore. And for the most part, everybody was, overall, I would say over the 55 years, most people were really nice to me. But sometimes when you're young and you're timid like I was, you have to take criticism and you have to take rude remarks. And you just keep going on, moving forward. But then the thing is, I've never forgotten any of those instances. I remember them all. And I go down a long list and I go, like, that guy was a prick. That guy was an asshole. And, I can name all the names, most of which of those people are dead now. So, I managed to outlive them. But, you just, what are you going to do? If they're in charge and they're the boss, what are you going to tell them?
Right.
It's either, you learn to take it and then take the money and run, and then realize, okay, I don't have to like the person to work with them, but I'll work because I want the job and I want the money.
Hey, Robert, this is an exposure sheet, if I'm
yes.
correct, right?
This is an early exposure sheet from the Flintstones, and it might have been that on the left-hand side is the direction, and that might have been written by Bill Hanna or Nick Nichols, but I have a feeling that's Bill Hanna's writing. And in those days, the direction was a lot more sparse than what I would do later on and other people would do. But the animators, they were doing these shows for them in the early Hanna-Barbera shows were old-time animators that just knew their stuff, like leftover guys from the MGM days, like Ken Muse and I can't think of his name right now, but I can see his face. But there were a lot of old-time animators that were doing the work. So they probably talked it over with Hanna or somebody. But that's on the left is the direction. The middle columns are the levels. There's 5 levels on this exposure sheet, and they're exposing the drawings, and you can see how many frames they're on for each. Every dark line indicates 8 frames, so it's 16 frames down would be 1 foot of 35 millimeter film, and then 24 frames is a second. And on the far right is the camera directions also, which would tell them like what BG, this one's indicating a top peg, the BGs on top pegs, and any OLU will expose, and the field size and all that. So this is, I have some other sheets from the Flintstones, early Flintstones, that are like the closing titles or the opening titles of their exposure sheets. And to me, they're valuable because I like the Flintstones, and this is the first couple of years of the Flintstones, I think, were the best as opposed to what it later turned into. And to me, this is great stuff. And I'm glad that I found this stuff before it got tossed out.
Was that Ed Barge? Was that the other guy?
Ed Barge worked there. He was still working for them. And Irv Spence.
Right. Yeah.
And at this point, in the late 50s and early 60s, I don't think Ray Patterson was there yet. He had his own studio for a while, which kind of folded up, and then Hannah hired him, and he became the supervising director there. And yeah, they had a lot of the old timers that they had worked with at MGM for many years, and they were great animators, and so they could do this stuff, this brand new stuff. And Ed Love was another one. Ed Love had worked with Tex Avery at MGM, but Ed knew Bill Hanna, and I worked with Ed for a lot in the decade of the 70s. And that was a guy that you could really learn a lot just by observing. And he was a great animator. So he did a lot of work in the early shows. And there was a number of other animators that were old timers.
Robert, I would love to get to some of these questions that we've been saving in the chat. Steve, would you like to do the honors? Robert, this is what we call on the show Question Palooza.
All right.
So Steve's going to ask you some questions from the chat. We'll try to keep the answers brief.
Okay.
Okay.
This kind of ties into one of the questions Mike was asking earlier, but Stephen Hewlett?
Steve Hewlett used to be the business rep for the Animation Guild. I know Steve really well. He lives in Nevada now. He's a good friend.
Fantastic. Thanks for the question, Stephen. Robert, what do you consider the first significant TV series you worked on?
That's a good question. I don't know, because significant and good are two different things.
You want to take each one of those?
Yeah, because I worked on like the very first show I worked on would be significant because to me it was important. It was the first show. It was the Banana Split show. Not that it was a good show. And in it there were two cartoons, the Arabian Nights and Three Musketeers. And that was important to me at the time because it was my first entry into animation. Was it a great show? Absolutely not. But it was significant. And then, shows that came later on, much later on. I think there was a lot of stagnant shows that were done by Hanna-Barbera in the 70s and 80s. And it wasn't until the 90s when I think we started doing good work again.
Well, thanks for the question, Stephen. We also got a question from Kirk's Pencils, a regular from the YouTube. How was the Super Friends?
I enjoyed it at the time because I was a comic book fan, and I used to, in the 50s when I was buying comic books as a kid, my favorite comic books were Batman and Superman. I was buying all kinds of DC titles. And when I got to actually work on a show where I was animating Batman, I thought, oh, this is great. I'm animating Batman. But, those Super Friends shows that Hanna-Barbera did are not really, in my opinion, not very good. The best thing about the shows are, if you can come across on the internet, any of the storyboards that Alex Toth did. The storyboards he did were great, far better than what the show looked like. And but the show, it was fun, and I enjoyed it because it was work and I was animating. And
did you interact with Toth?
I met him once because I had a friend at the time that knew him, and at the time he was living in a house near the Hollywood Bowl. And he took me to the house, and his was funny. I have no memory of Alex at all. I don't know what happened. I just don't have any memory of that. Okay, I just remember going to the house, and that's it. So I don't know if I even talked to him. But that would have been in around 1971 or 2. So I just don't remember.
That's great. Thanks for the question, Kirk's Pencils. We've got one from Roger Ash. Robert, who were your mentors or influences in animation? I'm an animation nut, and I'd really like to know the names.
Ed Love, Ray Patterson, Herb Spence. Bill Hanna, because I got to work with him on the Jetson feature, and so I got to know him and work with him. He was a real character. He's not like what people think he was.
How is he not like how people think?
In the early days, Bill Hanna was a rough and tough guy because he was in charge of the studio, and I'll give you an example of that. This was told to me by one of the editors at Hanna-Barbera. There was Hanna-Barbera at 3400 Cahuenga, which was the last building they were in. The editing department was down in the basement, and Hanna was walking around in the corridor that split the entire building, and an editor didn't see him standing in the doorway, but he had his feet up on the desk and he's thinking out loud, and he said, "What should I put on my time card?" And Hanna, without skipping a beat, goes, "Why don't you put 40 hours of fucking off?" And that was Bill Hanna. But then by the time I worked with him on the Jetson feature, he was a really gentle guy because he was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. And whatever medication he was on made him a really nice, easygoing guy. And he was really pleasant to be with. And I used to meet with him each day and look at the dailies, or stuff that had been shot. And he would tell me like what he wanted to change. And then I would go do the changes. And he was really pleasant in those days. So, but in the early days, and I can remember being in a meeting where he called us when we were doing the Smurfs. We had to be there for an after lunch meeting, all the animators, and he showed up late because he had like probably a 3 cocktail lunch. And he comes in and he starts yelling at us for doing too much work, because he was thinking that if you do too much animation, you're shitting it out, which is probably true to a large degree. And he said, you have to do 60 feet of animation for your pay, and you can only do 10 feet of bonus, and that's it. And isn't that right? Now, Jay Sabri, the prick that gave me the routine about, the Smurf thing in the tree, was his like lawyer lieutenant. You could almost hear him click his heels, and he goes, "Isn't that right, Jay?" And Jay, like the asshole he was, starts naming names of people that were doing more than 60 feet. I couldn't believe it. What an asshole.
Damn.
But that was Hanna in the early days. And then later on, he was like super nice. Wow. He was really a nice, pleasant old man.
That's what. Roger, thank you so much for the question. See you in Baltimore. We got this is a question about your collection. And this is from Kirk's Pencils again on YouTube. Robert, what was your process when you started collecting old art? How was that first conversation in your request when you were like asking for the pieces?
Well, I used to, well, my friend, we used to ride our bikes to the studios. We used to ride our bikes over to Hanna-Barbera, and they had a big dumpster in the back, and they would throw the cells out after a show aired. They knew it was safe, so they didn't have to keep them. So we'd go there all the time, and the dumpster would be filled with cells, and we would just pull stuff out of the dumpster. And the same thing was at UPA. They had trash, the old-fashioned round trash cans on the side of the studio. Just go through the trash cans. Anything that was, sometimes you're digging through banana peels and coffee grinds. And I have some drawings that still have the coffee stains on them. But if it's in the trash, it's free. And any studio that we went to, one time my dad drove us down to Clampett's studio on a Saturday and did the same thing. And you posted some of them earlier of Cecil, and those were from the dumpster. So that's how we did it. And then I also, around 1961, I wrote letters to studios, and I had a bullshit excuse saying, "I'm doing a science project on animation. Can you please send me some cells?" And it worked. Hanna-Barbera sent me a cell. Some studios didn't. Warner Brothers sent me some cells, and UPA didn't send. They sent me a photograph, and Format didn't send me any cells, but I eventually got cells from them anyways through a friend of my father's. Got them. But I just started any way I could get the art was good, and that's what started me. And then over the years of working in the business, you come across stuff, people give you stuff. I bought some stuff from dealers and auctions, and it just accumulates.
That's wonderful. Thanks again for the question, Kirk's Pencils.
Did you ever write Disney? Did you ever write Disney? Dear Walt Disney, I'm doing a science project.
No. I never. That was the one studio I didn't write to, and I don't know why. I don't remember why I didn't write. I wrote to like Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera, UPA, Format Films, the studio that was doing Space Angel and Clutch Cargo, which was Cambria. I wrote to them, and they sent me a big photograph and a mat that I have of Space Angel. And,
Wow.
and I have the Clamp. I wrote to Clamp It, and he sent me a cell. I still have the cell, and I have a letter signed by him. I wrote to Jay Ward, and they sent me 3 cells, and I have the letter signed by Jay Ward. So I just, I stumbled on a great idea, and it worked.
Wow. Mike's going to hear some people rummaging through his trash later tonight.
Hey, Steve, before you go to the next one, I wanted to insert something real quick. So, what was it, like maybe the early to mid 90s? I was a cartoonist and still trying to figure it all out. And I got a side job working at remember this, Warner Brothers Studio Stores, I was a gallery sales guy. So that was like during that boom of one-of-ones and selling cells. And that market went up really quickly and went down very quickly. Do you have an opinion on that kind of like boom or bust of collecting?
Yeah, I think what happened was all of a sudden they thought like Disney started it before anybody else in the early 60s. They had the art corner at Disneyland, and they were selling cells, which I have one from Dalmatians that I bought at Disneyland in 1961 for $1.50.
Wow.
And they were selling cells. And then somewhere, I don't know who thought of it, but then Warner Brothers, Hanna-Barbera did it. Nickelodeon might have done it, I don't remember. But they all started doing these limited edition cells where they did new drawings, some of which I think were bad because they would put way too many characters in them. And people were selling that stuff and buying it for some reason. And then all of a sudden that market just crashed. And now you see those cells pop up in auctions, like Heritage Auction, and people will buy them because you can't buy them anymore. And I can't tell you why it crashed. Probably, I don't know, maybe the market just wasn't there, but it was big. Hanna-Barbera had a couple of stores. I know Warner Brothers had stores. I don't think Disney was selling them in their stores, but yeah, they were popular for a while, and for some reason, the market just went away.
I think maybe what happened was, and this is why the Warner Brothers store never sold comics, because their whole thing is the amount of money they can earn per retail foot. So if you got to put a comic book there and some little kid comes in and goes, and then you can't sell that. So I think what happened was that whole area that was a pretty big area in the store.
Yeah, the gallery.
Wasn't turning over enough revenue for them to say, I can put T-shirts there, a Tweety Bird. It'll sell faster than a $500 Sears cell.
Yeah, well, I think the cells, some of the cells, like I said before, I can't show it to you on camera, but I have one up here that I bought while I was at Hanna-Barbera, and it's from the Flintstones. It's got Fred, Barney, Wilma, and the kids, and all that stuff, and a printed background and signed by Bill and Joe. I thought, it'd be nice to have this. The problem with the stuff is, I think it wasn't costing them that much to make them, because at that point, they weren't inking the cells.
Right.
The cells were Xeroxed. And all the studios still had ink and paint departments. So they were relatively cheap to make. I think they were selling them for way too much money. If they had sold them for a lesser price, they would have sold more. But they all were going crazy. And Hanna-Barbera was just as bad as all the others, because I see them on the one page of the Hanna-Barbera site on Facebook all the time with cells from that vintage. And for the most of them, I don't particularly care for. But they sold them for too much money.
All right, thank you for that, Steve. Finish up the question.
All right, a few more here. Rama Randy asks, I didn't even know this was I saw this on your IMDb page and kind of what? So what was it like to work on Yellow Submarine?
First off, I got to say, Rama Randy is Randy Myers. He's the guy that I told you about earlier that works at Apple. He's the supervising producer on many of their shows. and he's a really, really nice guy. He's one of those rarities in animation where he is really nice. And I worked with him on Samurai Jack and the set on Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends and some other shows. I'm surprised he's even asking this, because I would imagine we might have talked about this before. But what was it like working on Yellow Sub? It was fun, because the only thing I was doing was I was working on the sequence where the blotching, where the blue meanies start sprouting flowers, the blotching sequence at the end. So I didn't draw anything that had the beetles, but it was just the blue meanies. And to me, it was fun because I knew what it was. I knew it was the Yellow Sub was a Beatle film, and I was a big Beatle fan. And it was fun because I'm working on a Beatle movie. And in my opinion, it's a really damn good animated feature. And it was a lot of fun. And it was at a really small studio. And I can still remember exactly where I was sitting in the second floor in the room up at the top of the stairs. And the desk was probably an old UPA desk. And it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed working with the people that were there, Ron Campbell and Dwayne Crowler, who did all the animation for those sequences. And I still have a lot of drawings here's another one. I would go in the morning real early into the studio, and anything that was in the trash was free. So I took drawings from the trash in their rooms of animation roughs or layouts that they might have thrown away, and I still have them. And models. And so I was, anything I could get my hands on, if it was in the trash, I considered that's free. I'm taking it. And
did you play Beatles music while you were animating on the Beatles?
No, there was at least one lady, I think, was sitting at another desk in the room I was in, and to play music would have been a no-no at that time, because the door to Ron and Dwayne's room they were so close that it might have disturbed them. If they played music, that's okay, because they were older and more senior. I didn't start doing music things until like the following year, when I was in a different building at the studio, and I had my own corner in this apartment, and I would play music in the mornings because I would always show up early, no one was around. But I was not playing any Beatle music at the time. I was concentrating on trying to get the damn drawings done.
Did you say how old you were when you were working on Yellow Submarine?
20.
Wow. That's fantastic.
Robert, were there any dumpster diving rivals? Like, did you run into your old nemesis in a trash can once in a while?
I can remember one Saturday when my dad drove Tim and I to Hanna-Barbera, because for some reason we just knew there would be cells in the dumpster, and there were a couple other kids there. I don't think a lot of kids knew it as well as Tim and I knew. But yeah, they were, and I've read other stories about people that would take buses into Hollywood to go to like Clampett or Lance's studio to go through the trash, but never really ran into. It always seemed like we were the only ones there at the time, especially at Hanna-Barbera, and we did get chased away once by Bill and Joe, because the studio, the dumpster in the back was in a weird area that the wind would blow through it, because there was a hill right behind the studio. So there was a lot of trash around, and I can see their point of view. They blamed it on the kid, myself and Tim, and they couldn't catch us. We just jump on our bikes and ride away. But what they did was they put a metal bar across the flaps of the dumpster with a lock on it. And then we took a big rock, and started wedging it in the side so we could reach in with our arm. And then one day after school, my friend Tim went by himself on his bike, and the padlock was off. So he took the whole bar and rode home, which was a couple miles ride. And he's got like a javelin, like a lance. And he took it, and that metal bar sat in his backyard for a good number of years.
That's amazing.
We would do anything we could to get this stuff. And, a lot of times they were really nice. Like sometimes we show up on a Saturday, and the editors would open the door and just bring out a big barrel of stuff and let us take what we wanted. It was a different time.
Yeah.
You can't imagine them ever doing anything like that now.
No.
I mean, they don't even have stuff. I mean, that's the thing. Like you said,
Right.
One of the things about the business that's very different now is that even the last board I did was in 2000. 14 or 15 on Secret Saturdays. That was still done on paper.
Yeah.
Now everything is done digitally. So even if
Yeah.
I was going to go back and do boards now, I'd have to learn how to do Storyboard Pro because everything I did was on paper. Right?
Yeah.
And then when the backgrounds, character designs, everything I did on the last shows I did was on paper. Ren and Stimpy was digital, although I could still sort of draw it on paper and then scan it and then go over it. But yeah, it was a very to me, the shows now are what I call, and you may disagree or you may agree, I call them like stamp style shows where everything is like these little pieces, same, and they just seem to like morph, but there's no layout anymore.
Well, it depends. If it's a 2D show, it'll get laid out, but not here. It would get laid out.
Right.
If it's a show being done in Korea or the Philippines or wherever, or Canada, they'll still do layouts for the 2D show. But, and I don't know, they might do the layouts digitally, or they might do it on paper. It just depends. I can't really say. But the problem I have with a lot of shows now, when I look at stuff that's current, which is almost never, because I'm not interested in it, to me, they all look the same. They have like the same style. It's like everybody went to the same school and they've got these templates and the character designs are all the same, which will probably change in another couple of years when somebody does an interesting design and it's a popular show, and then everybody will jump on that bandwagon and do that. But the unfortunate thing about the digital world is that the art doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
It's all in a computer, so you can't really touch it. You can't hold it. And yet there's a lot of art from a lot of studios that are sitting in Iron Mountain warehouses where the stuff just got stored. And it's like, it probably looks like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you could just walk through the place and look at all these boxes and stuff, and it'll never be seen again. And it's just sitting. I know that Cartoon Network was shipping stuff off to Iron Mountain constantly. All the old Hanna-Barbera stuff, I don't know whatever happened to it. Hanna-Barbera used to have a place at the studio where they had a room where they had all boards going back to the early 50s and stuff that they had. And then they had stuff in file cabinets, and all that got shipped out to Sherman Oaks when we moved to the Warner's building in Sherman Oaks. And then I know the person who was supposedly scanning everything, and no one seems to know what happened to that stuff.
Yeah, I heard that. I think, was it in Mice and Magic, one of those books I read where they said that, that Warner Brothers basically threw all that great stuff out back in the day. They just trashed it. They didn't keep it.
Well, yeah, that's true. Like, I've read the stories where, the guys at the old Warner's building in Hollywood, the animation studio, would throw the cells on the floor and then jump on them and slide, like, slide. They didn't care about it. It wasn't important to them. And going back even earlier than that, when the cells were on nitrate cells, those are almost all gone because that stuff's flammable. And the one studio that's over the years kept a lot of stuff is Disney, because they still have a giant big archive of animation art. But they're the exception to the rule. You got to ask your, like, I met Walter Lantz, and we went to his studio when we were in 1964, and he gave us a bunch of his cells because we asked for it. But I'm thinking, like, what did he do with all the artwork up until that year and after that year? Because he was still open into the early 70s. It must have all got trashed.
Right.
Well, that's a lot of room too. I mean, that sort of ties in a way to what I heard why Jack Kirby did not get a lot of his stuff back at the beginning, because he was producing so much stuff that he didn't have room. He probably could have. I've heard some people say that he could have gotten it back, but when you're doing 4 or 5 books a month, that's like a huge stack, month after month after month after month after month.
Yeah.
Where are you going to put all that?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I know that he eventually got artwork sent to him, but a lot of it, he didn't get. And it's like, the story of, Carlton, the Charlton Comics, where they were literally throwing the artwork on the floor to sap up, for the rain or leaks or stuff like that, and tearing it up and throwing it away. in Hollywood, that seems to be the norm. At least it used to be. Like, there's no sense of history. It's like throw it away, tear it down, get rid of it.
Let's Steve get to these last 2 questions.
All right. And this is a sequel from Rob Randy. Did you enjoy working with Sergio Aragones?
I never really worked with Sergio, but I will tell you this: I consider myself friends with him now because I first met him in the '80s. He would come in to visit the guy that was in the room next to me, Lee Mishkin, who was an all-time animator, and that's how I met him. And that was when he first started doing the Gru comic book. I see Sergio practically every Friday because I attend a Zoom meeting with cartoonists, and Sergio is one of them. Scott Shaw's another one. Rich Moyer and I'm trying to think of the other guys. Stan Sakai, and there's a bunch of cartoons, and it's just the conversation is about comics usually and cartoons, but about anything you want to talk about, and it's a Zoom meeting that I attend usually every Friday. So I consider him a friend. He's really pleasant and nice, and I just never got a chance to work with Sergio.
Well, thanks for the question, Raw Randy, and thanks for being here.
Robert Randy, he got that name from me because I used to say that to him at the studio. I would always call him Robert Randy. You have to say it like that, and so he started using that for his email and other things.
Love it.
Fantastic. And this is a question, you kind of touched on this a little bit. U.S. adult audiences don't generally go for animation. With Arcane and Blue Eye Samurai, I think those are both on Netflix.
Yep.
This may be changing. Do you see animation for adults becoming a thing?
I think, look, animation is always going to be around. It's not going to go away. And there's always going to be a segment of the audience for adult-oriented animation stuff. It's like, look at what Gendy's done with his show Primal. And yeah, it's going to be there. And it's always going to draw in people. And there's always going to be the audience for the younger audience for the kids stuff. I just think it's great if you can get anything on the air and get an audience for it. And I admire anybody that can get a show on air because that's the toughest thing about animation is selling the show. Once you sell it, it's easy from there on in.
Thanks for the question, Alejandro Yegros from Facebook. And that's it for our Question Palooza.
Good job.
Yeah. I also think that Samurai Jack was my favorite thing to work on. One, because I got to write on that show, so I actually got a writing credit. And it was very interesting working with Gendy because he would basically give you this loose plot, and then you would do the whole board. And I did a few shows, but one show was really interesting. That it's the one where he's pursued by these bounty hunters, and originally the bounty hunters,
The Catamundi.
huh?
The Catamundi.
Yeah, originally though, one was like one looked like Tundro, one looked from the Herculoids, one looked like a Shogun warrior. So I boarded that whole thing.
Right.
And then when I saw it later, sent it in, we talked, loved everything. When I saw it later, completely different than what I did.
Yeah, they were like lion characters.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thing. I directed that episode. And it's
Really?
It's one of my favorites because it turned out really good. I like that. And of course, I like the one that won the Emmy, Birth of Evil, because why not? Got me an award. And but I directed that particular one that you're talking about, and it's a good episode.
Yeah.
So I never saw the board the way you did. I only saw it the way it was finally done.
I will send you a link. I have it on my Facebook where you can actually go and see what I did. But that was very different because the one that I did that went all the way through without really very minimum changes was the one where he fights the rock guy inside the mountain, which was his takeoff on that Walt Simonson comic. And so that was a very different experience than, say, working on even like Superman or Batman, because on Samurai Jack you had no track to listen to. There was no actors or anything. And on the other shows, you would listen to the actor if you got a tape, and then you would try to, you know, incorporate their acting into your board. So that was very different on that show.
I did a lot of work on the first season of Batman whenever they first did it.
Right.
Except I didn't get screen credit because I was under contract at Hanna-Barbera at the time, so I told them don't put my name on it. And I had a bad experience, but towards the end of the season, I couldn't get arrested. I would call up and go, oh, and here's a classic thing for all you young people that want to get into animation. If you ever hear this excuse, it's bullshit. We're behind in scripts. That's one of them. That's a bullshit excuse. And the other one is we're going in a new direction. That means we don't want to use you. But I kept hearing we're behind in scripts, behind in scripts. I finally gave up calling the production manager. So one day the one time I was asked to by the previous production manager to go in to meet with the director. Once again, those Warner Brothers were the people that started that thing of giving the credit to the storyboard artists as directors, and they're not directing anything. They're just doing the storyboard. I would go into his room and I figured he's going to tell me some interesting stuff or what he wants. And he hands me the storyboard, and you would slug the board on the original board in those days. And it was about this thick, and it was just one act. And he said, I think it should be around, I can't remember exactly, 500 feet. I said, oh, you rough timed it? He goes, no, I just think it should be around 500 feet. So I just looked at him like, oh, okay. And I went back into the production manager's office with her because she went in with me. And I said, that guy's an asshole. What do you do? Weigh it and decide that it should be 500 feet? How the hell did he know it should be 500 feet? And that was the only feedback I ever got from anybody on that show. And then all of a sudden, I'm persona non grata. And to this day, I still don't know why. And I'm there after that, picking up freelance on another Warner Brothers show. And I just was like Laurel and Hardy timing. I got to the elevator, and it's the production manager from Batman stuff and Superman. And I said, look, I know what you're going to say, but I just want to let you know, in case you have any freelance, just keep me in mind. She gave me the same bit. We're behind in scripts. 10 minutes later, I'm sitting in another producer's office waiting to get the handout. And she walks in with a package, which I know is in it, is exposure sheets and a storyboard, to a guy that I knew. And she goes, oh, yeah, send this to Vincente. And I'm thinking, what am I, an asshole? Like, oh, what am I, blind? I see what you're doing. And I never got the reason why. Obviously, one show that I did must have come back and there were problems, but they never gave me feedback. They never brought me in and said, hey, look, don't do this, don't do that. Nothing, zero. Now we're working at Warner Brothers because Hanna-Barbera moved there after they sold it. Turner sold it. And a producer, I'm doing Count Chicken. A producer comes up and he goes, hey, they're looking for people who want to do freelance on Batman Forever, whatever the hell the title was. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, I am, but they won't use me. He goes, what do you mean they won't use you? I said, trust me, they won't use me. The next day he comes back to me. He goes, God, you were right. I talked to Steve Swartz, I think was his name, who was the overall Warner Brothers production manager. And he said, yeah, I meant anyone but Robert. I got really pissed off, and I called him up because I figured he couldn't fire me anyways because I'm working for Hanna-Barbera. And I read him the riot act, and I said, son of a bitch, you guys never give me any feedback, and you give me all this shit, and and I went on and on and on. And he goes, oh, do you want me to talk to Bruce Timm? I said, fuck Bruce Timm. I don't give a shit about him. No, he's not going to do anything. What do you think, he's going to tell you the truth? Fuck him. And I never worked on any of their superhero stuff again. And to this day, I don't know why. And keep this in mind. If I'm so bad, how come I have more Emmys than Bruce Timm, and I've been nominated more times than Bruce Timm? Fuck Bruce Timm.
Bam.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a strong words.
Yeah.
That's the me now. When I was younger, I would have never acted that way.
Sure.
Joe Barbera switched at some point.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I'm half Basque, and if you know anything about the Basque people, they're really rough and tough. And I'm like my mother was. I just don't take shit from anybody. And if you piss me off, I figure you can kill me, but you can't eat me. So I don't care, and I just let people know. And that's the way I've got. In my older years, I've turned around that way.
That's great.
I love it. The chat loves it.
You know, I think artists should do that more often. Should stand up. You know, okay, you may lose a job, but you know, it's better than having people just walk all over you and lie to you, which happens a lot in animation too.
Yeah.
And tell you bullshit stories. I mean, that happened to me too on the last season of Billy and Mandy. The producer and the show and the creator, Adam, both said to me before the season, because I asked him about doing freelance again. I freelanced on all the seasons of Billy and Mandy, and I directed both of his pilots. And on the last season, once again, couldn't get any work. And I asked, and he said, "Oh, we don't have any money in the budget for freelance." So I said, "Okay, fine." I never thought that they were lying to me, which they were. And I went up to see Adam on the last day of his work at Cartoon Network, and he's coming out of his room. I didn't even get a chance to say hello or goodbye, and he's drunk from lunch, and he says to me, "It was Julie. That was the person who was like in charge of the animation direction. She was the one and I said, okay, now I know." So I eventually went and confronted who was the producer of it. I said, "What's up with all this bullshit? And I knew you had freelance." And now get this, he pulls a clipboard off the wall that has a list of people that were freelance. And he goes down and he names this one person, a friend of mine, that had 7 handouts. And at the same time, he's telling me there was no freelance. So, you know, that's the shit you have to deal with sometimes. And I just said, okay, fine. You know,
I only had a situation like that working at Nickelodeon on Fairly Odd Parents.
Oh, was it because of Butch?
I didn't work with Butch. I was working
Lucky
with
you.
Dave Thomas, who's a real nice guy. But I think what happened was they had Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Seinfeld, come in and do Wanda's sister, Blonda. And so I got my thing. I did my board. Then she comes in and she changes all the dialogue. She ad-libs all the stuff. So for the listener, usually you would get 4 weeks to do a board, 2 weeks to do a rough. You get your notes, and then you're supposed to have 2 weeks to do your changes.
Cleanup, yeah.
Right. Well, that's not what happened.
Because you have to change all the
They have
dialogue.
all that time, and then they come back with 1 week, and I have to do the whole board, basically all the stuff over. And I told them I can't do it. And then I end up having this argument with the producer on the phone. Starts accusing me of being unprofessional, and I chewed her out. That was the last time I worked with him. I said, "How dare you accuse me of being professional?" I brought it up with the union, and the union basically told me, which is another thing I learned, that if you bring up a problem about a studio, the union will not back you up, and then the studio will blacklist you.
That's true, but you can file a grievance, but then you have to suffer the consequences, and it gets down to what is it worth to you.
Right, and that's what the person on the phone.
Yeah, well, I don't know who it was. It might have been Steve Hewitt, who was the business rep at the time, but I have a friend who was doing storyboards for Butch Hartman on Fairly Odd Parents when they first started up, and he was in a meeting or in a room, and Butch says to him, I got to find some directors. Now, Paul, who was the storyboard artist, had worked with me and Dave Brain on Cow and Chicken, so he knew us really well. And he goes, "Yeah, well, how about Dave Brain and Robert?" And Butch's answer to that was, "Oh, I don't want to hire those hacks." Now, that prick, he says that he would never have the courage to say that to my face, but he'll say it to somebody else. And I know that he said this because Paul told me the story twice on 2 different occasions. I always tell people, Butch is not who you think he is. And I know a lot of other people will tell you the same thing. But I'm glad I never actually did. Although what's funny is before it was a series, I did work on some of the Fairly Odd Parents when it was on Oh Yeah Cartoons. I guess he just didn't remember that.
Yeah, but that was a really learning experience for me, because you realize that studios will routinely, like I said, you're supposed to have everything, and you start at 4 weeks.
Yeah.
But routinely, you don't start on your first week. You routinely would start on your second week, which would mean that you would already have 40 hours
Right.
on, but they would still expect you to turn in the work. And if you raise a stink, the union rep basically told me, you know,
Yeah, it was Steve was in a difficult position because, you know, like if you were to file a grievance, you would have to actually file the grievance, and you would have to go through all the motions, and it would eventually get a hearing and all that sort of thing, and you may not even get anything out of it. And it's true that you would probably become persona non grata at Nickelodeon. So you have to weigh the good against the bad. But if it's something that's really, really big, like say, for instance, they owed you a shitload of money and they weren't paying you, and you file a grievance, that's different. But yeah, I know Steve told me a lot of times that he would deal with people all the time and tell them basically like, okay, but you got to be willing to go to the bitter end and deal with the consequences. Because he could not guarantee you that there wouldn't be any consequences, but he would do only what you ask him to do if you follow through with it. So, you know, you probably did the smart thing by not filing a grievance.
yeah. But I mean, these are things, again, you learn on the job.
Yep.
These things can affect your health and, you know, your reputation, but the idea that the studio is being unprofessional to expect, because I told them, if I was in the studio, you'd hand this out to a whole bunch of other people. You wouldn't expect one person to do it because you know it's not possible.
Yeah.
But because I'm freelance, they expect you to do it. And
freelancers would sometimes get the short end of the stick, but this is why I also highly recommend people to make voodoo dolls.
Pro tip.
Might work.
But yeah, so you know, there's all these things that you learn as a professional that you're just thinking, I want to work on a cartoon, I'm enjoying and doing, but there's all these other things that come in with the personalities of people that can affect your. And I'm not blaming the director, because the director was a nice guy, and basically his hands are tied because the producer then goes, hey, this is a hot show, we got a hot star, oh, we want to make sure that we're still hitting our dates, not that we've totally screwed the pooch.
Right.
Yeah, it's a lot of egos enter into the equation, and you know what? You're not the only one that's ever experienced something like that. That's happened a lot of times.
Guys, we're going to start wrapping this up. We're in overtime. Robert, I say this to all of our guests. Where'd the time go? I hope you enjoyed this conversation.
I enjoyed this. I really appreciate the fact that you even reached out to me and asked me to do this, because it's not like I do this every day and talk to people about what I've experienced in my career and all that. And I appreciate the fact that you guys had an interest in talking to me.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the whole thing about this. It was the whole thing about me doing the magazine, is that I've always felt that one of the things that hurt us as artists, especially the further back in time that you go, people were afraid to talk about things, or people didn't like to talk about things. And that empowers artists to talk to each other, to inform each other, to learn from each other, not to be jealous of each other. That always works against you in the long run if you're jealous of other people, I think. I had a friend of mine, Ricardo Villagrano, told me once, when young artists going into an agency, and they had these, top illustrators at the agency, when you would come in, they would take a blanket and put it over the front of the thing they were working on, because you're not going to look at my work and learn anything, right? You're not going to learn anything and then come and take my job. But cartoonists and animation, that's how we learn. I mean, you just explained how you learn, by watching other people
exactly
do it.
Before we leave, I will tell you this one last thing. There was this man, his name was an animator. He was Bill Kyle was his name, and he was the supervising animator at Hanna-Barbera for a while until he retired. And back in the day, the big thing was people in animation drank. and they always had like a bottle of booze in their desk, and that was really big. And he once said, "Boys, I talked to Jim Beam this morning, and everything's going to be all right." The funny thing is, working in the business for 55 years, I've accumulated a lot of stories, and I kind of forget about them until I'm asked about it. You know, I could go on and tell you stuff that I've experienced or happened to me, and you look back now and they're funny, even when they were bad things, and they're funny. But I really thank you guys for reaching out to me to let me, at some part, rant, because I don't mind ranting about people that I don't like, because I'm at the point where, what are they going to do to me? I'm not in the business anymore, so they can't fire me.
No, do you still draw? Do you still do
No.
things for your on your own for your?
No, I kind of lost the desire to draw after when I was animating for all those years, that's tedious work. And I got to the point where I was only directing, and I went, this is good, because I don't mind not drawing, because I was putting in long hours, 7 days a week, working in animation, and I don't miss the fact that I kind of wish I could still do it, but I don't have the desire anymore to draw. And occasionally I'll pick, I'm sitting at this desk where I spend most of my time each day. I might draw something, but I usually wind up throwing it away because I go, oh, this is awful, and I just throw it out. But I just don't, right now, I don't have the desire to draw. And to be honest with you, I've seen a lot of your work, Mike. I can't do what you do. So you'd have to see some of the stuff that I do when I do now, and you'd go, yeah, put the pencil down.
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Someone's gonna fish through your trash.
Yeah, I'm coming.
They're only going to find banana peels and empty bottles of from stuff that I drink during the day, not booze, because I can't do that anymore. But no, I don't draw anymore, and I don't miss it.
Huh? That's interesting. Now I know other artists have gone through that. You know, maybe you'll come. Hopefully, you'll come back to it if you want. But I have talked to other artists, both in animation and in comics, and they didn't keep their own sketchbooks or draw for their own pleasure. And there was times earlier in my career where I was so busy working that when I wasn't working, well, I was always working, so I wasn't doing stuff for myself. But I think one of the things that I found that was really important to me was that I must always be doing something for myself, because when you're feeding other people and you're solving those other people's problems, sometimes that can, even though you can have a rewarding career, it can kind of make you sour a little bit. You kind of like, well, what it drains you. What are you putting back in?
Yeah, so everyone's different. I'll give you an example of Sergio Aragones. When we have those Zoom meetings, he takes a break, and he always shows us what he's been working on. But he's told us many times he is constantly drawing. He draws every day. He cannot sit in front of a blank piece of paper without drawing something on it. So he draws all the time, and he's like, I think 87 or 86 years old now. I'm the opposite. I can look at a blank piece of paper and go, yeah, it's blank. So what? And I don't have to do it, so it doesn't bother me. And everyone's different. My good friend Tim Walker he's got Parkinson's, but he's actually luckier than you would think, because he had one of those special operations at Stanford where they do deep brain stimulation. And if you were to see him, you would never know he has Parkinson's, because it really worked for him. He used to paint watercolor stuff of cartoony characters, and he did it for I don't know how many years, and he got to the point where doesn't want to do it anymore. Every time I talk to him, he said he has no desire to draw or paint anything anymore. So it happens. It may be a thing because Tim and I are both almost the same age. I'm 76, and maybe it's like, oh, I've been there, done that. I don't have to do it anymore.
Maybe.
Well, I think what we should do another time is have you back on, Robert. I think we had a great time.
I would be happy to come on, and Randy, if he's still around, will laugh at this one because you poke me like you're poking me with a stick like a monkey, and I will name names and tell stories, and I like doing that, telling the stories of the good old days, and I don't mind telling stories about people I've worked with, good ones and the bad ones, and I thank all your people that are watching that put in those questions. That's very kind of them. I hope I answered them well enough. And this was great. I don't get to do this all the time. It's like I sit at my desk that I'm sitting at now during the day, and I'm watching videos on YouTube. And I'm fascinated. My latest thing that I'm fascinated with is I'm watching a lot of videos about people who collect comic books and sell and deal in comic books. To me, that's fascinating. And especially when I see stuff that I used to have and don't have anymore, and now it's worth a fortune. But I still have a big collection of it. But I watch stuff on YouTube, and I do my Facebook page, and and I'm leaving out some facts. The reason, health issues, and the reason why I retired, it was a health issue, and my legs are shot because of a problem I have with my legs. But I don't do much of anything, so I'm always available. Anytime you want to reach out to me, I'm here.
What would you to sort of end on a positive note? I mean, you've been in the business, we're in the business a long time. You did a lot of. What would you advise the younger people who want to get into animation in a time that is very turbulent? Because I mean, your career also spanned the time where you were on for 6 months and then you didn't have, maybe, it wasn't 12 months worth of work, right?
Right.
So what would you advise people are looking at spending $200,000 to go to college, maybe some of these schools?
Well, first of all, the business is sort of turning into the way it used to be in the 1960s. You don't work all year. Streaming was not the golden road to anywhere. It turned out to be a giant nightmare because of streaming services like Netflix. You don't even get a full 13 and a half hours for a season. You might get like 10, 6, and then 3, if you even get 3 seasons. So my advice to them would be, if you can get a job, don't waste your money in going to art school, because you'll wind up having a lot of debt and spending a lot of money, and you may not even get in. So try to get in, take tests. I assume that studios still test people that have not worked with them before, and they're available through their websites. Call, if you can find producers or showrunners, contact. What's the worst they can say? Like, don't bother me, or get away. Contact as many people as you can, and bone up on your drawing, because they want to be able to see if you can draw, and learn to. You don't want to show them your version of what they've created. They don't want to see you like a SpongeBob. They don't want you to see drawings of SpongeBob. Do something different and practice your drawing, which I never did, and keep up. And the big thing is, if you really want to get into animation, don't give up. You got to keep trying and trying. You're going to get turned down. Everyone gets rejected. I got rejected, and at some point you'll get in. And the important thing is to get that first job, because that's where you build your career. You get the first job and you start knowing people, and then you work with them, and you may work with them again later down the road, and they recommend you for a show, and you build your career. And then here's another thing. Don't piss anybody off for the first 20 years, because you want to stay as a friend. After 20 years, you can start saying, oh, fuck you. But be kind to everybody for the first 20 years. But keep dedicated. And when you get that job, don't goof off. Don't bitch about the money. Sit your ass down, put in the hours, and do your work. And if you do all of that stuff, you will be successful, because people want to work with people that show up on time, don't miss deadlines, and do good work.
Wow. Enough said. I love it.
Fantastic.
Robert, thank you so much for your time and attention and your stories tonight. It was fantastic. Thanks for everybody for watching with us live. We watched the replay. You're watching Jim Mint 10 Internet. right here. So we'll be back here next week with more stuff. Have no idea what we're doing, but you'll be the first to know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Before we go, we have a little outro thing. I hope you'll do it with us.
Okay.
So just last week we celebrated the King's birthday. So in honor of him and for all of our legacy people out there, I would be remiss if I did not ask you to wash your Kirby hands. So put some Kirby hands up, Robert.
There you go.
There you go. Very good. Awesome. All right,
Yes.
guys. Have a good night. We'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Night.